A fox knows many things, but a hedgehog knows one important thing.
Welcome to the Spiritual Hedgehog podcast, where we explore the role philosophy and faith play in your daily life. Here are your hosts, Ira Gardner and Pastor Eric Dahl.
Welcome to another episode of the Spiritual Hedgehog, and Eric, we had planned to talk about some other things, but I think we can't ignore what's going on in the country right now and what's going on right here in Spokane in relation to the George Floyd death in Minneapolis and the Black Lives Matter protest and secondary and auxiliary protest and rioting that's happened, I believe, in Spokane for the first time. Actually, we had some rioting and looting happening, and so it begs to ask the question of what do you think has led to the rise of nationalism or racism to kind of show up now, and more specifically, what role has Christianity had in the sanctioning of racism in America historically?
Yeah, well, I think unfortunately, historically, just about as long as Christianity has been around, it's been tied a little bit too much to nationalism. Whether you're looking at Emperor Constantine, or whether you're looking at the wars that were happening and the crusades that were happening, that tied, religion into sort of this nationalistic movement, to the war, the great wars, to present day, with our current administration. I'm just not going to be shy about that anymore. I think one of the most upsetting things as a pastor was to see our president, first of all, disperse a group in Washington, D.C., and claim not to know anything about it, and yet wants to promote this position of power and walk across and then hold the Bible upside down as a photo op, instead of thinking about what the Word of God is. So I think there's this whole connection of right, and right is might, and this idea that for my religion to be true, we must be the most powerful, and if we are the most powerful, then my religion is true. And so it gets wrapped up into a nationalism that is really unfortunate and really counterintuitive to what Christ is all about. And to see that, I think as Christians, we need to admit it. We need to look at it deeply and say, if that's what we're tying ourselves to, if we're tying our faith to our nationalism, we are totally missing the boat on, at least for me as a Lutheran pastor, as a Christian pastor, on what Christ stands for. My mind goes all over the place, Ira.
Sure.
But so I will try to kind of get a little more concise right now as I think about that. What about you? I mean, what have you been thinking about in as we look at this, the looting and the different things that are happening, the rioting, also combined with, many peaceful protests that are going on simultaneously with thousands and thousands of people that are just trying to raise that awareness.
Well, so I will tell you, in our local community, I was deeply moved by a press conference that the mayor gave in conjunction with community leaders. President from the local NAACP chapter was there, the police chief was there, and there was a recognition that the primary protest movement was peaceful and was a healthy expression of something that needs to be addressed. Yeah. So I was very moved by that. Excuse me. My own personal experience over the past week has been a little bit torn over the fact that I really think that we live in a country that doesn't have enough marches and enough expression of opinion, and so I felt torn over the fact that due to the COVID-19, my own personal fear of being in large groups of people due to my underlying medical issues prohibited me from actively participating or even documenting as a photographer. I mean, some of my colleagues have shown me some incredible photographs, or very poignant photographs. So for me, it was troubling not to be able to participate that way. And then, but on the other hand, I was really moved by the fact that my father, who grew up in what I would consider to be a very ultra-conservative religious household, that that he will tell you that he describes himself as a recovering racist. He sent me an article that was written by former WSU football player named Gabe Marks, that wrote a very compelling article about how it wasn't enough to not be prejudiced or consider yourself not racist, that now is the time to be anti-racist, to get activated around making some structural fundamental changes. And so I was thrilled that my father would actually share something like this that really dealt with some issues that I think I didn't expect him to respond the way he did, because frankly, I'll tell you, he voted for Trump. And he has since developed a regret over that. I think starting with the Chancellor Phil reaction to the protesters being run over back in Chancellorsville. So I was very moved by that. And then in my typical response, I was drawn into research. So I was drawn to watch a 3-part series of lectures given by Jeffrey Robinson, who is the deputy director of the ACLU legal department, that gave a history of racism in America. And the thing that really hit me over the head with that presentation was that his definition of racism has 3 components. One of which is prejudice, the second is social status, and third is legal authority. And I think the part that was most hit home the hardest was the fact that you can be not prejudiced, but you cannot not be racist if you are the beneficiary of a system that is that you have social status that you can't help. You were born into it, social status and legal power, that until those things get modified and balanced out, I cannot help but represent the oppression of racism in this country, just by virtue of the fact that we haven't done enough to change the system.
Yeah, that's right there is probably the most humbling thing there is, isn't that? I've read a number of things lately that have been talking about, until we are able to understand that we are in places of privilege, and until we are willing to give up that privilege, change will not happen. So what I've been taken back to a couple of things. I shared this in one of my homilies. Was I remember being just struck starkly. I have a friend in college. His name was Wensley Herbert. He was born in India, but moved here when he was about 3 years old. And so, but he had come to Minnesota, where I went to college, from Colorado, and had Colorado license plates, and had kind of a dark shade on his car as he drove into Minnesota, and he almost immediately got pulled over by the police. And he had a Caucasian friend in the car with him on the side, and he was pulled out. He was pulled out of the car and examined and given the 5th degree in a way that just wouldn't have happened if it was you or if it was me that got pulled out of that car. And I was questioning, I said, really? It surprised me. It showed my own ignorance, but he goes, Eric, you just don't understand what it is, what kind of fear. And so as I've been listening to more and more of the news reports and the protests, watching 60 Minutes, watching just different interviews about how the place of privilege that we are allows us to keep ignorant about much of what is really happening for people that are in a different position. And so as a person of faith in the midst of that, I think I've been really struck to say, how do I really show that I am standing with different, not only Black Lives That Matter, but Hispanic, and you see a lot of this with China these days. Just these different areas of folks, these different groups of folks that are being labeled, and the prejudice just carries on. So I'm curious. You gave this definition of these three areas. First of all, I would argue, I learned early on, again, growing up in St. Louis Park, that we are all prejudiced. That was ingrained in my head. Just, we all prejudge, just think about who are those groups of people that, if you walk in, that you don't feel quite as safe around. And why is that? Are you prejudging some things, or is there good reason? Sometimes there might be. But beyond that, that second set, looking at that social status, how is it? I mean, can you imagine what those steps might be? And I guess what I want to play with a little bit with you is what those steps might be to look at our social status and what we need to release in order to make others feel more comfortable in the country that they love.
Well,
it's a tough question.
I'm torn. Obviously I'm thinking about, what is it that I can do to be proactive, to combat. I'm thinking about how complex the issue is. And I'm thinking about the fact that, I know several police officers and deputies, and there's some really fine human beings, my next door neighbor. And so my initial thought is that this is a problem that belongs to all of us. And then I start trying to figure out where is the psychological origins of this problem. And actually I've got a list here because it's a complex issue, and just a little bit of review of where some of this comes from. One aspect psychologically is something called social identity theory, which simply says that we all have a strong sense of self that is defined by the groups that we belong to, and we divide the world into an us and them. And at the most basic level, we can divide by culture, we can divide by ethnicity, we can divide by economic status, we can divide by sports team. And I've talked about it, the us of motorcycle riders and the them of car drivers, and I've experienced that social identity. And so what happens with the social identity theory is that we always see the other in a derogatory less than status because we're trying to protect our own sense of identity. And the other major component of that is the inability to see the individual. And so social identity theory really raises the moniker of stereotype vision of the world, that we see them as, and we actually heard our president say that about, he's used this kind of code word for white nationalism by describing, people on both sides, but those people. And he's referred to, for example, the football players that want to kneel during the Star Spangled Banner. And yet, if you look at the history of racism, you look at the actual history of the Star Spangled Banner and look at the third verse, you know that we have institutionalized a poem, a song that is founded in racism. So social identity theory is one. Another one I find really interesting is this compensation theory that says that if I do something good, it gives me permission to do something naughty. Like if I go exercise 15 minutes on a treadmill, I can eat that chocolate cake. And at a social level, it's more the case of we can give ourselves permission, if you will, to gravitate towards these racist, stereotypical viewpoints of the world, because we can say, well, we elected Obama, so therefore I'm not racist. Or we're not a racist country. But then we get this kind of boomerang effect that says, well, now that he's out of office, we get to go back to things as they were. And there's another factor, social proof theory, which basically says if we don't know how to behave, and this is our children, by the way, this is our children. If we don't know how to behave, we look for examples in leaders, in popular, important people, and how they behave affects it makes it okay to behave. And so when you see church leaders, when you see political leaders, or you see musicians with song lyrics acting in a very negative way, it gives permission. It says, oh, well, this is okay. And so you have people that are maybe on the fence that end up going along to get along, so to speak. And then finally, and probably the most important one of the whole list of them, and I think it's a combination of all of it, is this idea of moral licensing. And this gets back to where I think Christianity has a problem. And this moral licensing is this theory that says people that perceive themselves as righteous and good people are more likely to commit unholy, unrighteous behaviors. It's kind of like, how many scandals have we seen of people that are just these, bastions of righteousness that end up having some serious dark secrets. And so this idea of moral licensing is that if we see ourselves as being good, we're literally giving ourselves to behave in negative formats, negative manners. And that's the one that I think that we're really struggling with right now.
Ira, where do you think fear plays a role in all of that? I mean, is it, you look at, as you kind of the social identity, do you think it's, if I allow another individual to be right, then does that put me at risk? If I allow this group to have equal say, where does this put me at risk? And is it a fear? Is it fear driven in some of that?
I'm not an expert, but my hunch is it's a combination of fear and a history of trauma. Native Americans have this concept of 7 generations, that it takes 7 generations to wash away the pain of a trauma, and that we pass down trauma and fear that then turns into aggression towards others. I mean, it's a recurring thing. And so when you think about the formation of the United States, you see a country that was formed, the founding fathers, we didn't have women included in that leadership role. Majority, all but maybe 6 of the people that signed the Declaration of Independence owned slaves. And so you have this conflict that is deeply seated in our country, that somehow I think what starts out as maybe a fear of not enough resources, a fear of, we saw this with every immigrant group coming through, by the way. They're taking our jobs, taking our livelihood, they're taking our land. This sort of fear based upon wanting to be positioned in a superior way. But then I also see this other fear of letting go, to a fear of admitting that we're wrong. And I think that's another kind of fear that we have, is that we hold on to, maybe we hold on to traditions, and we hold on to things. And again, I'm going to keep going back to Christianity, the fact that so many, if you look up some of the white nationalist churches, they're very much based on a religious platform of dominionism. And that you see a lot of pulling from the Old Testament, and you see a lot of this mindset of there is a natural divine order to the world that is being carried out, and yet there's a complete ignorance of really what Jesus was teaching.
Right. Well, and I guess I would even argue a lot of that stuff on dominion. First of all, just taking us back to Genesis, if we think about the two creation stories, it's interesting. God, created humankind in God's image, male and female. God created them. Okay, so there's first this image that as you move forward, doesn't say God created white male in God's image. It's humankind, and it's really an inclusive piece. And then the creation story, the word that often gets translated as dominion over, is really that's not the sense of what Genesis is trying to get at in that creation story. When God gives the birds of the air and the animals and the plants and the sea creatures and all those things, the idea is that humankind was created to be caretakers, that we were given, and so if we move from being a caretaker to someone that is having dominion over, it becomes very problematic. Well, we know, as you look, unfortunately, the Bible, has been used throughout history. The Word of God, as I would call it, has been used throughout history in ways that have been very damaging. What do we do with the fact that, with slavery, that, there's justification in the Old Testament? It was used, through the beginning, halfway through the 1800s, almost into the end of the 1800s, to justify slavery, because it's there in the Bible. So if it's there in the Bible, it must be okay. Instead of moving and seeing that Scripture is moving us in a trajectory that says, God, not only did God create humankind, but in Christ, then there is neither Jew nor Greek, male nor female, slave nor free. And to understand that Jesus is so radical in his understanding of how we twist that he doesn't even use the word servant. Really, when he calls us and says you are to be servant of all, the word really is slave. We are called to be slaves to one another, but that's that individualism of how do we understand that we are called to such an extent to be looking after our neighbor, to be serving our neighbor. And if we all started from that place as individuals, knowing whatever humankind came in our midst, it seems to me it would change the way we looked at morality quite a bit. So
really you're expressing the fact that a servant leadership style is what's really being described.
Yeah.
And that, to be leaders in our community is to be there to serve one another. And you see that, during difficult times. I mean, when there's a major storm, when there's, the outpouring of people willing to volunteer, and we've seen that with COVID-19. So I have faith in humanity. There's a part of me that's excited about the fact that some of these things, I mean, with the momentum of Me Too and Black Lives Matter and dealing with DACA and immigration rights, and the fact that there are people that are willing to stand up and be accounted for. I still have hope, but it is a very, very difficult time, and I think we have to parse through. I was just today working with a group of faculty on how we assess critical thinking skills. And one of the things we look at is if somebody is taking things too literally and not able to apply knowledge and deal with the ambiguities of life by being able to assess and solve problems and analyze. And I think sometimes the Bible gets used as this literal device to pound people over the head with, or to create these this and us narratives, and that we're missing the whole point.
Yeah, that's one of it's interesting, and I have these conversations with my parishioners all the time. Of what brought you back to church, right? And it's often what brings them back to church is when they have kids, and it's a moral thing. Right. For so many, it's not a spiritual faith thing. It's this moral thing that I have a responsibility to teach my kids what's right and wrong, and religion should do that. The problem is that idea of just coming up with what's right and wrong wasn't really the purpose of Christianity. The Old Testament is trying to understand who God is and where God is leading. And yes, you're going to get the 10 Commandments, but that's in order. How do we keep order in society, a healthy order in society? And then Christ moves us, and you look at, again, when does Jesus get really angry? I think I've said this before. When Jesus gets really angry at those who seem to be certain about their righteousness, about that they know the right way. And so what makes the Pharisees and Sadducees and some of the Jewish leaders really upset are those who, are following those 360 whatever number laws there are, and they're doing it very well. And then Jesus, and they're talking about being the chosen people, and then Jesus says, well, who does God come to but the widow of Zarephath, who's this outsider during a time of plague? Who does God come to? It's but Naaman, who's healed from his skin disease, again a leader of a great army that's not the insiders, and they get so upset that they try to throw Jesus off the cliff, and I want to be careful there, because it's just one instance. You can look at any world religion and you can see the same thing that happens, that immediately, back to some of your original points, as we start to focus and want to surround ourselves, and we get the social identity of what's happening, and we want to be able to identify and be confident in our identity. But without, as you're talking about, without some critical thinking to start to see people as individuals, to parse out our education, without some critical thinking ideas, and if we get locked into this, this is what how many times have you heard this said? It's what the Bible says, and if the Bible says it, I believe it, and if I believe it, I'm going to presume, it's got to be true, instead of, what question is this trying to answer? And where is Jesus trying to lead, or where's the Buddha trying to lead us in a deeper understanding? Or, where are the prophets trying to push us in the Jewish faith? Or what was Muhammad trying to get at in some of the teachings, where he recognizes things that are of a spiritual nature, that are more than just me getting ahead. We live in this world of scarcity, that there's never going to be enough. There's not enough. And I think that drives us to this fear that if I don't get mine, and if I don't protect mine, then I might lose. Instead of, look at this world God has given us, and it is so abundant, and there is more than enough, more than enough. Thinking about Walter Brueggemann, who really challenged this idea of scarcity to say that's the whole battle of the Exodus, is to get the people to understand that God has provided enough. There is more than enough. So if we take that, then if we look at the specific situation, after the, killing of George Floyd, and after the protests, and then the looting that's happening, and this turmoil that's happening, I think we need to first take a step back, especially as white, you and I are white males that have every privilege given to them and have had every privilege given to them. What is it for us? We need to be the ones asking, is there a place for looting? And that sounds really, I need to ask that. I'm not the one that can really challenge in quite the same way those looters that are doing so to try to make a point that corporations are running the world, and that the five big corporations run most of the world, and you keep looking at those things. So I want to be careful that we try to bring out the best of faith practices instead of going into those old tapes that tend to play over and over in our lives. How we best do that in this time continues to be the thing I'm really trying to figure out.
Well, I think, the challenge, I'm going to go back just a little bit, and I'll just tell you that I have a certain lens that I look at world situations or life situations. And one of them is that if somebody says they have the exact answer, that's somebody I'm nervous of, because I think answers are always specific to a set of variables, and that we have to have a philosophical lens that is process-based, value-based, and that we need to be open to the subtleties of nuance in life. And so I found it very interesting is that you will get religious leaders that say, I know the way. And those are the ones that righteous indignation that comes along with that leads to this moral licensing that I think is problematic, as opposed to saying, I know the process for discovering your life journey and what's going to be helpful. And so I tend to focus on trying to open up to a process, and open up to a value system. And I do think that, unfortunately, so one of the lenses I try to look through is through critical thinking and information literacy, and this idea of, we live in a time where we're bombarded with media, but most of that media is designed to promote fear, because we know that gets at our fight or flight, what's the brain, the amphibian brain.
Yeah,
the amygdala, the amphibian brain that gets to this action, because most media is designed to get you to act, to purchase, to buy, and to do something. And so we're bombarded with media, news, etc. And yet the reality is, if you look at an individual at the individual level, there's generally a way to form a bond, a relationship, a bridge that extends beyond those fears. And I think of, again, I go back to the why travel has always been important to me, is people that travel the world will tell you that there are wonderful people in every part of the world, and that you can't evaluate a people by their governments or by the news, that you have to be on the ground to meet the people. One of which we have one of my very best friends is Persian. He's Iranian. And it was interesting to hear a story recently about somebody that visited Iran, And of course, we have this very antagonistic relationship as a country politically with Iran. And yet the culture of Persian culture is one of the most giving, loving cultures you will ever come across. And you just hear story after story of this, and yet that's not what gets shared in the media. And I think what I was so impressed with here in Spokane was some of the photos that actually showed protesters and police officers hugging in unison.
Yeah.
And that's not the story you're going to hear very often either.
Well, right. A couple people, where some people were trying to set American flags, and the peaceful on fire, and the peaceful protesters were putting them out and said, that's not what we're doing here. And there may be a place for that sometimes, but I think it's trying to say what's going to get that message out. So you use the word lens. What's the lens? The theological word that I learned was hermeneutic.
Yes.
Yeah, it's the same thing. It's what's the hermeneutic that you are using to first admit that to ourselves? What is giving us our worldview? What is propelling us in that direction? And so as I've been listening, a couple things, I was really struck listening to this movement that's making a lot of people very nervous to defund the police.
Yeah.
Well, right. Again, if we do this either or sort of thinking and say, well, right, the fear base that goes to us is who's going to protect us, who's going to protect those vulnerable people. We can't just defund the police. Instead of saying, what they're getting at is to say, will you help us? We've tried to make subtle changes in our in the police department to deal with these racism questions, and it hasn't worked. So how do we defund it in a sense where suddenly you call 911 and homeless, instead of the police always being the first line of defense, maybe it's a person that deals with homelessness and knows all those connections. So maybe the 911 call goes to that person.
Medical and social workers
for mental health issues. Who's going to get those first calls? And so listening to Minneapolis and listening to them to get first they tried to get the mayor to say, will you? And the mayor probably couldn't make the promise yet, so walked away. But then they got the council members, and I forget, it was like eight of the council members agreed. Yeah, we will look to defund. Well, I have a nephew who wants to get into the police department in Minneapolis, and he's, I know, been really struggling because you get into that thinking you're going to have the support of the community behind you. And I think, like you said, your next door neighbor, I forget if he's highway patrol or what he does.
He's county sheriff.
County sheriff.
Yeah.
And I've met him, and very good guy, and had a number of members of congregations I've served in the past. This isn't, again, 9% of police officers, I think, are good people, or I want to believe that, and I know it's definitely more than half and more than 70%, but there's going to be those bad things. And so instead of saying all police are bad or they all are good, we've got to get away from that either or thinking into that critical thinking piece again, to say, all right, this is an issue. How do we hold one another accountable to really try to think creatively to make a better society, to make a better culture? We always get pulled back into what's easy. We always get pulled back into maybe what's worked before. And so I think the challenge I have, and I'm curious, Ira, is how much does education play into this piece of critical thinking? Is it?
Well, I will tell you from my perspective, and again, this is my implicit bias as I work in higher ed, although I work in a very unique position within higher ed in that I teach in a career technical program. So my program is directly related to contributing to people participating in our economic system and becoming productive workers and business owners, et cetera. But I also bridge that gap with liberal arts education, where you see historically the teaching of critical thinking and creative thinking and information literacy and quantitative literacy. And these are the metacognition skills necessary to become flexible and adaptable to changing technology, changing history, to be able to put things in perspective. And I kept thinking, as you were talking recently here, kept thinking about, we haven't had a conversation about by what metrics do we determine what is success in determining what is well-being for society.
Yeah.
And yet I can tell you that we have some metrics that paint a pretty negative picture. We have metrics to say that rates of incarceration are extremely high in this country compared to other parts of the world. We have metrics that say that we are not the happiest country in the world, and we are not the most educated. We don't have the best healthcare. And yet we live and cling to this idea of we're the best country in the world, but we aren't using metrics to actually measure and assess it effectively. And we look at, is individual wealth better at the consequence of having 90% plus in poverty? The top 1% control over 90% of the wealth of the country. Is that a metric that is healthy for society? And so the thing about metrics, and the thing about, I'm going to use the term evolution. Every generation is evolving into a different world. The world my father grew up in doesn't exist for him anymore. And the world I grew up in is disappearing fast. And so our metrics need to evolve to take into consideration new variables. And that's where to me, the solution to this is wisdom that is developed through compassion and developed through remaining inquisitive, even in the face of adversity, which comes back to, how am I responding to these difficult times? I've exercised my mind to find out what are some of the core issues associated with it. And hopefully I'm starting a conversation. Hopefully we're starting a conversation for people to start thinking about, what are the metrics that we use to define success? And what are the metrics that we use to define equity, not equality? And that's another interesting thing too, is this idea of equity versus equality. Equality is everybody has the same. But the reality is, we know in this country, and in every country really, when it comes to racism, when it comes to us and them, we're not born with, we could have the same equality, but not have the same position in social status and legal power. So equity is about bridging that disparity. And I think we can do our own internal analysis of what is my role in my community? Am I doing everything I can? And what's interesting about this, though, I will tell you one other really important thing, is that right now I have found the most important thing I could do is be willing to listen to hard conversations. And what I mean by that is, last week, and it happened to be on my birthday, I participated in a video meeting that had over 100 people. And the whole purpose of the meeting was for my colleagues of color to be able to express their experiences with racism in their life, in their everyday life. My job as a white male was to sit and listen and not interrupt, not try to even, just to listen and just to sit with it. And that actually was hard work, but it was profound. And I think to just, and it goes back to, I think we had a conversation not too long ago about this idea of how support groups offer tremendous therapeutic benefit and yet the primary activity is to sit back and listen and just be with one another. And so that's kind of the path I'm taking at the moment, as well as trying to start meaningful conversations that are based in real metrics, real history, real numbers, that challenge people's traditional, stereotypical beliefs, such as the Second Amendment. And there's just, we do a whole nother episode, and I'm not going to go there, but it just, what I'm finding is the more I dig in to find out the backstory of what this country's formation and its history, the more adept I feel I am to help respond in a way that can help challenge people's to move from their preconceived traditional notions into something more equitable.
Mm-hmm. Was listening, as I said, I was listening to 60 Minutes the other day, and I'm going to forget what her role was, but she's so articulate. Justice Defense Fund, or she was the head of that Black American, African American, that just so articulate and kind of explaining some of those very things that you're talking about how we do fail to really hear one another. We jump to our conclusions. It's like even you and I have talked about how on this podcast, right? How do we make sure we're really listening to each other instead of always jumping to the next thing we need to say? I think there's a reason Jesus said so often, those who have ears to hear, let them listen. And thinking about what is that difference between just hearing and really listening. I can hear the words, but if I'm not listening and paying attention, I'm going to miss the boat. But that articulation of we keep wanting to skip steps, and she talks about is we just never do the work that we need to do in order to really deal with racism and really deal with the inequity that is there. And that's the same with, I think I first became aware of that in the Native American populations, how, because they were socialized in such a different way, it's been such a difficult thing for them to fit into our white Anglo-Saxon American capitalistic culture. And without doing the deep listening, there's reasons sweat lodges have a place and a huge history. It allows, again, I think, for some of that critical thinking to take place, not only in this heavily educated, which, I'm obviously, believe in education, but I think I want to be careful for myself to say, I also need to listen, to those, 50-year-old non-college educated single moms, that haven't had even gotten their high school education, and what have they learned? What's their experience, and what do I need to learn from their experience? How do I listen to them as much as I listen to all the metrics that are going on there? It's a both and. I mean, that's part of critical thinking also. But
well, I think I'm going to circle back and kind of wrap up with this idea of calling. Mm-hmm. And that this always will come back to, what is my calling? And my calling is going to be very tied to not my well-being, but the well-being of others. And that, I'm coming back to this, also circling back to this idea. It's not enough to be not racist, but actually need to be actively engaged in anti-racism. And I start thinking about, well, what's my calling? Well, I'm an educator, I'm an artist, and those are my tools that I will use to try to encourage wisdom in our community at a time that's very hot, heated debate. And then the other thing I think about is I want to listen and figure out where I'm called to act and serve and be invited in to act and serve. And I think of unique opportunities I've had over the last couple of years where I've been privileged to make powerful photographs of people that are actively engaged in these issues. There's a poetry group called Power to the Poetry, and Bethany, who started that group, just showed up one day in my studio, and she did this powerful rendition of a poem she wrote about Black Lives Matter. And I'm just like, wow, what can I do to help you? And so I ended up doing some portraits for their group. And I think, I'm not going to go out and try to insert myself, but I'm going to listen, and I'm going to be accepting of invitations where I can fit in to help. And if I can't fit in to help, I can at least donate financially to organizations that are doing things. So I do think about the Southern Poverty Law group and the work they've done. And this is near and dear to our hearts here in the Northwest because of the history of Aryan nations and those sorts of things. So I guess that's where I'm leaving it for me today is, where do I go from here? And it's a very humbling time. What about you?
Well, I think for me, it's to not, I'll put it in the positive, to speak, to use the avenues that I have to speak what I think is the loving gospel of Jesus Christ in the midst of a tumultuous time, to say that there is always hope. And so in the midst of there always being hope, what does that mean? And it means for us as Christians, how again, coming back to what you said earlier, how do we serve? What does that servant leadership really look like? There's a cross in our church, Ira, that hangs above the altar. It says ICXC Nike, basically from Nike, Jesus Christ conquers. And it's this stark reminder that Jesus Christ conquers through the ultimate sacrifice, through a death on a cross. But it's power in weakness. And Jesus is always one that showing us it's never power over, but it's either power underneath or power with. And so how do I find those avenues to think about, again, that relationship of power and where I uplift others in front of me, and even instead of me at times as a person. So whether that's in job searching, whether it's in, whatever it may be, how do I understand that I do come from a place of privilege? And how do I listen to where those places are all the more, even when it makes me uncomfortable? Because I to use an old Gandhian phrase, when he was challenged about thinking about, what do you think of Jesus? He said, I like Jesus, but it's the Christians that I tend to have a problem with. And so as I continue to journey with Jesus, for now, I'm content to be restless. Well, our time for contentment needs to be done, unless if we make that being content to be restless. So that's where I hope to go with it.
Well, thank you, my friend. This was challenging, but appreciate the conversation.
It is, and it needs to be challenging for us, and that's okay. If we're not wrestling with it, we're not listening. So, yeah. Thanks, Ira.
All right. We'll see you next time.
All right.
Thank you for joining us today on The Spiritual Hedgehog. For show notes and more information, go to www.thespiritualhedgehog.com.